Our School, Book Number 3. Mrs. Roopy is Loopy by Dan Gumman, picture by Jim Pallet. Today we read Chapter 4 to Chapter 6. Chapter 4. Dumb Bats. I took a sit in the lunchroom next to Ryan and Michael. Ryan stuck a two of my carrot sticks in his nose, and I told him I'd give him a nickel if he ate them. He did too. Me, I won't even eat carrot stick before you stick them in your nose. Do you think that guy were really George Washington? Ryan asked. I don't know, Michael said. What do you think, AJ? That's when Andrew Young leaned over from the next table and opened the mouse. That wasn't George Washington, you dumb bat, she said. That was Mrs. Roopy wearing powder wig and an army uniform. She may have been right, but I don't want to admit because I hate her. Ryan took out a dollar bill from his backpack and looked at the picture of George Washington. He sure looked like George Washington, Ryan said. George Washington has been dead for like 100 years, Andrew said. Even if George Washington was still alive, Emily said, I'm sure he would have more important things to do than come to our school and read us stories. That one hit me. If that guy were really Mrs. Roopy, up as George Washington, maybe Mrs. Roopy isn't a librarian at all. Maybe she's just pretending to be a librarian, I said, just like she was pretending to be a George Washington. Yeah, Michael said. Maybe she's a kidnapper and she got out with a librarian locked up in an empty warehouse at the edge of town. I saw that in a movie once. We got to save her, Amy said with tears dripping down her cheek. Then she went running out of the room. There's only one way to solve the problem. We cleaned off our tray and went back to our classroom to ask Miss Daisy if George Washington was really Mrs. Roopy in disguise. Don't be silly, Miss Daisy said. As it turned out, Mrs. Roopy is absent today. She's homesick in bed. It must have been the real George Washington. But what does Miss Daisy know? Everyone knows Miss Daisy is crazy. Chapter 5. Mrs. Roopy's Hero. Everybody in our class were excited for the next library period. We all want to see if George Washington would be there again. When we got to the library, there was just this lady who looked like a little bit like George Washington, except she didn't have an army uniform or wig. She looked like a normal lady. Good morning, second grader, she said. My name is Mrs. Roopy. I'm sorry I couldn't be the other day for your library period. But you were here, Ryan shouted. You must be mistaken, Mrs. Roopy said. I was home sick in bed. Can we see your wooden teeth again, Michael asked. Yeah, can we? Wooden teeth? Do you know that George Washington didn't have wooden teeth at all? His mouth was filled with cow teeth. Ew! You will shout. I asked Miss Daisy, did the cow have George Washington in her mouth? But that was you, wasn't it? Acting like George Washington, said Michael. Mrs. Roopy's forehead got all wrinkly, just like George Washington did when we told them about computer. I don't know what you're talking about. We all looked at one another. I wasn't sure if she was telling the truth or not. If I were a George Washington, would I have this? Mrs. Roopy asked. Then she picked up her shirt and showed us the belly. She had a little tattoo on her right over her belly, but button. It was cool. I had to admit that George Washington would never have a heart-shaped tattoo over his belly button, so maybe that army guy with the wig wasn't Mrs. Roopy after all. Let me show you around the library, Mrs. Roopy said. Do you know that book can take you places you have never been before? They help us explore our world. We have books here in just about every subject you can think of. This is fiction section. Does anybody know the difference between fiction and non-fiction books? Non-fiction books are books that are non-fiction, Ryan said, because non means not, like non-fat milk and no fat in it, and no sense and no sense in it. Michael added, that's true, Mrs. Roopy said, but there's a little more to it. Fiction is what you get when you rub two things together, I said, over the laugh, even though I didn't say anything funny. That's fiction, AJ, Andrews Young said. Fiction is made of story, and non-fiction is based on facts. That's correct, said Mrs. Roopy, and she smiled at Andrea. I wish Andrea would shut up. Oh, who cares what the difference between fiction and non-fiction is? I said. All books are boring. Everyone went, ooh, like I had said something really trivial. But everybody needs to know how to read, AJ, Mrs. Roopy said. Not me, I said. When I grow up, I'm going to be a street bike rider because you don't have to know how to read to do tricks on a bike. Yeah, me too, said Michael and Ryan. We told Mrs. Daisy that every day after school, me and Michael and Ryan ride our bikes together. I learned how to ride a two-wheeler in kindergarten. Now I can do a bunny hop on a bump, and I know the name of all the famous trick bikes rider. I have posters on them all over the wall of my room. Gee, I don't know much about bicycle tricks, AJ, Mrs. Roopy said, but I got a poster of my hero on my wall at home too. Who is your hero, Mrs. Roopy? Andrea asked. Mobile Dewey. Melby Huey? I asked. Melby Dewey was a very famous librarian, Mrs. Roopy said, and her eyes got all bright and sparkly and excited. Librarians aren't famous, I said. Melby Dewey was, said Mrs. Roopy. He invented a number system we used to find books in the library. If it weren't for Melby Dewey, we would never be able to find anything. Wow, Andrea Young said, as if she was interested in that boring stuff. So if you want to find books about insects, you go to number 595, Mrs. Roopy said. And if you want to find a book about dinosaurs, you go to number 567. Libraries all over the world use the system that Melby Dewey invented. Today we call it the Dewey Decimal System. Did all the kids at his school make fun of him because his name was Mobile? I asked. I know that if there was a kid named Mobile in our school, we would make fun of him constantly. I don't know, Mrs. Roopy said, but would you like to hear a song I made up about Mabel Dewey? Yeah, we would shout. Listening to song, I had to be better than reading books. Mrs. Roopy ran in her office and came right back with a guitar and one of those harmonica things you wear around your neck. She strummed a few tunes to warm up. You may have heard a folk tale about John Henry the Steel Durable Man, Mrs. Roopy said. Well, this is the story about Mobile Dewey, the book-sorted man. And she started to sing. When Mobile Dewey was a little bitty baby, the first word he said himself were, I gotta get this book off the floor and put them on the shelf. Mrs. Roopy sang the whole song and played her guitar and harmonica too. It was a pretty cool song. This Mobile Dewey guy had a race on computer to see who could sort a book the fattest. Mobile won the race, but right after he sorted the last book, he dropped dead right on the floor of the library. It was cool. At the end of the song, Andrea Young got up and gave Mrs. Roopy a standing ovation, so we had to get up too. That's the saddest story I ever heard in my life, Evan said, wiping tears from her eyes. At the end of the period, Mrs. Roopy asked us if we had questions about how to use the library. Is it true that if we don't return our library books on time, you'll lock us in the dungeon under the school? I asked. Everybody laughed, even though I didn't say anything funny. Don't be silly, Mr. Roopy said. And the dungeon is on the third floor. I think she was telling a joke, but I'm not sure. Chapter 6. Johnny Applesauce. Then we came into the library the next time. A guy with a long beard came down the ladder from the treehouse, wearing blue jean overall. He was carrying a shovel and big sack. He had no shoes on his feet, but he was wearing a pot on his head. He looked funny, and he looked a lot like Mrs. Roopy to me. Miss Roopy, why are you wearing a pot on your head? I asked. Roopy? The guy said in a funny voice. Yo, young, might be a confession me with some other feller. My name's Johnny Appleseed. It's the year 18,000. I travel from time to time planting apple tree. Most everyone wonder, you're not Johnny Appleseed? And this called out, you're Mrs. Roopy. I'd never heard of no Roopy, the guy said, making his forehead all wrinkly. Appleseed a name, planting apple trees my game. This here's a darn big country, and I wagon for are gonna need a heap of apples. No matter what he said, we couldn't convince the big guy with a pot on his head that he wasn't Johnny Appleseed. He read us a story about Johnny Appleseed and told us a lot of stuff about apples. Did you know that folk haven't eaten apple for thousands of years? Johnny Appleseed told us. They should chew faster, I said, and everybody laughed. Then Johnny Appleseed took us aside and helped us plant a real apple tree near the playground. Before we went back into the school, we had apple for a snack. I can't understand why he planted all those apple trees. I can't understand why he was dressed funny. But what I don't understand is where he wore pot on his head. That Johnny Appleseed guy was weird. When we got back to class, I told Miss Daisy all about what happened during library period. Do you think books are boring, AJ? She asked me. Yes, I said. Next time, we'll read chapter 7 to chapter 9. My Weird School, book number 3, Mrs. Roopy is Loopy, by Dan Gunman. Picture by Jim Pallet. Bye.